So Andrew Tompkins, with whom you've been in touch per email, Andrew is the person who organized most of the conference, will give a brief introduction and the conceptual framework of the conference, so into embodiment, environment, and infrastructure of borders. And then I will speak a couple of minutes about why borders are so relevant for this particular region and for Polish history. And afterwards, we will have the keynote by Michal Frankl. So, Andrew, the floor is yours, at least for now.
I'm going to say a few words about why we've brought this conference together under the title Border Matters. So, as many of you probably know, the last 2 or 3 decades have witnessed the development of an interdisciplinary field of border studies. And we thought, therefore, that making borders the focus of the Foundation Conference would play to the many different disciplinary strengths of the Max Weber Stiftung's member institutes. So I'm very glad that we had the hearty response that we did and that you're all here to join us. Within the field of border studies, as many of you again are probably already aware, concepts have changed rather rapidly in recent years. Most scholars no longer think about borders as border lines or lines on a map. If they're lines at all, then they're probably lines in the sand, as the title of one early essay by border studies geographers called it. Lines in the sand because they're written into a foundation that's constantly shifting. More often, we speak of borderlands, probably, in the plural to draw attention to the surrounding regions on all sides of any given border, and therefore also to the kind of local interactions that take place rather than perhaps relationships to a central administration somewhere else. Using the tools of the spatial turn, scholars now discuss the production of borders through social activity with both human and non-human actors engaging in bordering and border work. And finally, in order to talk about their complexity, border scholars have started speaking of multi-layered border scapes and interwoven border textures. So while all of these concepts are very exciting and new, and the terms are in many cases very new, they draw on long-standing ideas such as Georg Simmel's statement that you find up here from 1906, which I would loosely translate as the border is not a spatial phenomenon with social effects, but a social phenomenon that takes spatial form. We've chosen to focus this conference as much as possible on 3 aspects of borders in no particular order of importance: environments, infrastructures, and embodiment. And since we're at the German Historical Institute in Warsaw, I thought I'd give you a glimpse of some examples from the German-Polish border. This is, of course, a historically sensitive border with millions of Poles and Germans having been forced to migrate to or from the area after the borders of both countries were redrawn following the Second World War. At the same time, it's now a generally peaceful internal border within the Schengen area, which means that it's not subject to border controls, at least in theory. That means that most of the border checkpoints have been dismantled, and the border is not always clearly marked. That's perhaps most obvious when you think about a water border, which is particularly difficult to mark. It's a highly specific kind of border environment where modern Westphalian notions of territorial sovereignty are particularly difficult to impose. Today, one can simply walk along a beach promenade from German Albeck, the border fishing village, or I guess now mostly a tourist town, of Albeck to its Polish counterpart in Świnoujście. The sun and the sand might also almost allow you to forget the fact that throughout the Cold War, Poland and East Germany had a running dispute over their shared water border on the Baltic, and that happens to be the topic of the presentation that I'm going to give in a couple of days. In fact, most of the Polish-German border actually follows bodies of water, specifically the Oder and the Neisse rivers, the so-called Oder-Neisse line famously being an object of dispute between Poland and West Germany for decades after 1945. Rivers, though, are of course rather tricky borders since their banks can erode, they can flood, they can even change course. And they can also vary greatly in size, as you see here. The Oder, or in Polish Odra, is about 1 kilometer wide at some of its widest points, whereas the Nysa, as you can see, is so narrow that during the Cold War, people could actually swim or sometimes just walk across in order to illegally enter East Germany or Poland. Of course, most people opt not to swim across and instead rely on border transportation infrastructure, which along a river is usually going to mean a bridge. However, many of the bridges that were destroyed in the Second World War were simply never rebuilt, like this one that you see here at Graz an der Oder. In some cases, post-war infrastructural decisions have taken on new meaning over time, such as for this bridge that leads to nowhere in Forst, which after 1990 was rededicated to the German refugees who had drowned fleeing the former East in 1945. A working bridge is also not exactly a guarantee of strong border ties in every case. This one that you see here was completed in 2014 at a cost of nearly 5 million euros, and it connects the 332 residents of the German town of Koschen with their 117 Polish counterparts in Żytowiec. Obviously, the road serves a larger area than just these two villages, but the new bridge has only attracted about 20% of the traffic that it was initially expected to serve. Elsewhere, between Gozdowice and Güstebiza-Lose, Germans and Poles are, in some sense, fair weather friends. They are connected by a ferry service that actually only operates seasonally and in good weather. Don't get me wrong, though, of course, there are other bridges elsewhere along these borders that people actually do use and that are in good working order. Finally, the third concept that we wanted to stress was the embodiment of the border. While checkpoints along the Polish-German border have mostly been dismantled, that does not mean that border checks themselves ever actually ended. The Schengen system actually expanded police powers within a broadened border zone, making controls largely invisible to those who possessed the right passport and an appearance to match, but omnipresent for many of the people who did not. That has meant that migrants, or anyone perhaps mistakenly perceived as such, in effect carry the border within their bodies wherever they go. More recently, first the German and then the Polish government both dropped the pretense of invisible, supposedly open borders and reintroduced stationary border controls. Even this has not been enough to satisfy the racist right wing that visible border clampdowns are intended to pander to, with groups like Robert Bonkiewicz's border defense movement, claiming to patrol the border themselves rather than allowing border guards to do it in order to stop migrants from crossing even legally into Poland. So, with that, I'd like to give the microphone back to Magda, who's going to talk about the sort of long-term historical importance of borders in Central Europe.
Thank you, Andrew. So, as Andrew mentioned, it's not by accident that borders are such a relevant topic for our research at the German Historical Institute in Warsaw. Currently, we are 4 research groups at the Institute. We do research on memory cultures, history of violence, construction of space and regions, and history of migration and mobility. And obviously, the topic of borders fits primarily into the latter two research topics, so space and migration, but has also much in common with the other two, namely memory and violence. Why are borders so important for East Central European history, which is at the core of our daily research work here at the Institute? Because in hardly any other region in Europe, borders have changed so often. We're not talking about small corrections, but about large shifts between empires. In the course of its history, Poland had borders with the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the German Reich in Prussia, the Habsburg Empire, and some other no less relevant countries. These borders changed after many wars and treaties. It's not an uncommon experience here that people were born in one country or even empire, raised in another, and died in yet another without ever leaving their village. On the basis of various atlases in our library, our librarian Artur Koczara, who's unfortunately not here, but great thanks to him, prepared a short visualization of the most visible border changes on the map of East Central European history, and we can have a short walk through history, through East Central European history, from the 11th century through the 14th century, 15th century, 16th century, 18th century, 19th century, 20th, up to now. Each of these borders is much more than just a line on a map, being a result of geopolitical constellations. As Andrew already explained, borders are material structures with border posts, barriers, and guards. While for some people they are open gates to another country, for others they are barriers forbidden to cross. The complex material and legal forms of border infrastructures have been therefore well studied by anthropologists, sociologists, historians, lawyers, and even engineers. For these reasons, borders have also a highly symbolic potential. I'm sure that many of you know the German propaganda photo that allegedly illustrates the German invasion of Poland on the 1st of September 1939. Today we know that it was actually taken by a German photographer from Gdańsk 2 weeks later. A wooden barrier does not need to be broken by 9 men, so the photo is staged, of course. The barrier does not need to be broken by 9 men, and usually there is no national emblem on a barrier like this. It was taken from a nearby forestry building to increase the photo's symbolic and political strength. The picture's purpose was namely propaganda. It was widely used to illustrate how easy it was for the Wehrmacht to invade Poland. After the war, it was reprinted in many textbooks as an example of German propaganda. It was also referred to in critical artistic work, for example, by the Polish photographer Zbigniew Libera. In 2014, a year before the nationalistic party PiS took power in Poland, the photo, or rather a quote from it, was reused again in a magazine that supported the party. This time, it illustrated a series of articles about Germans being barbarians during the occupation of Poland between 1939 and 1945. The article also suggested that Germans still posed a threat to Poland, hence PiS must have taken care of the security of the country. While the artist Libera quoted the initial photo in an ironical tone, the supporters of PiS were fairly serious. Yet the cover would have gone probably unnoticed were it not for another reuse a year later. So the photo on your right. So the photo the left photo, which was the first one, or image, it's actually not really a photo, would have gone probably unnoticed were it not for another reuse a year later, 3 weeks before the parliamentary elections in 2015. Please note that this is quite the same picture, but photoshopped. The German soldiers were just replaced by the stereotypically presented refugees. The picture suggests that they are as dangerous for Poland as the invasion of 1939. The two captions together read as "Barbarians are coming." Today we know that this particular anti-refugee campaign from 2015 influenced the elections and helped PiS win them. Apparently, the image of the attacked wooden barrier with the national emblem proved extremely powerful, probably even more powerful than in 1939. The symbolic power of border infrastructures in East Central Europe became an issue once again in 2021, when the crisis on the Polish-Belarusian border started. The Belarusian regime pushed thousands of refugees to Poland. The Polish border police pushed them back. Many people got stuck in this hopeless situation, a topic which Michal Frankl will address in another historical context in his keynote. Many other refugees even died when trying to enter the Schengen zone. We still do not know how many victims this crisis has caused. In 2022, the PiS government started building a large fence resembling the one that Donald Trump's regime erects at the border between US and Mexico. You see here the ex-Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki, who was Prime Minister under the PiS government, and then on the left, how do you say, Innenminister in English? Interior Minister. Thank you. The current government continues this mission with the support of the European Union. Neither in Poland nor in Europe has there been any serious public debate about these solutions. Peripheral in location, they have been implemented in a so-called secured border zone, where representatives of the civic society, including journalists, were not allowed to enter. Although the political context of bordering are most visible when talking about state borders, the topic of this conference is broader. Distinctions between regions, between urban and rural spaces, sacred and profane sites, protected and unprotected landscapes, etc., are often equally powerful. At the same time, the materiality may have huge impacts on people's mobility and the bodily practices. Given the importance of these issues for our research at the GHI Warsaw, we are very much interested in insights from other institutes of the Max Weber Foundation. The positive response to the conference is a clear signal that bordering practices, not just in the context of state borders, are among the commonalities of the research conducted at our institutes. They constitute an important topic to be studied together within the foundation.
First of all, thank you, Andrew, for the preparation. It's great to be part of this conference. And then I would also add a few words of thank you to our interns. So with any issues you might have, you can also contact Fabrice and Alicia Kautitz, Fabrice Leitloff and Alicia Kautitz, who are sitting here, and they also contributed to the conference. But I'm the deputy director here at the Institute. It's my great pleasure to work here, and from my behalf also welcome to Warsaw, everybody. I'm also working in the research area of mobility and migration, so this conference is of course very dear to my own research interest. But that's not very important. What is important today is Michal Frankl, so it's my great pleasure to introduce Michal Frankl, a dear colleague, a collaborator and partner of the German Historical Institute from Prague. Michal Frankl studied political science at Charles University in Prague, where he also achieved his PhD with a dissertation on Czech anti-Semitism at the end of the 19th century. Between 2008 and 2016, he was head of the Department for the History of the Shoah at the Jewish Museum in Prague. Later on, he was senior researcher at the Masaryk Institute and Archives of the Czech Academy of Science. 2019 to 2025, he was a principal investigator of the ERC project Unlikely Refuge, Refugees and Citizens in East Central Europe in the 20th Century, a group of fantastic researchers who produced many articles. And I mean, that is also the reason why we invited you here today, because you are the expert on these topics. And yeah, so it's not without reason that Michal Frankl, since last year, is now the head of the GWZO Department Knowledge and Participation in Prague. For those of you who don't know GWZO, Maren Röger is the director. She's also here. And it's the Leibniz Center. Yeah, so I have to pass on the English title, exact title.
Leibniz Institute for the History and Culture of Eastern Europe.
That sounds good. Leibniz Institute for the History and Culture of East Central Europe. Yeah, thank you for helping me. And the Department Knowledge and Participation was opened last year in Prague, and Michal Frankl is heading it with right now, yeah, I think it's the team is now at 4 people. So yeah, good luck with your new job. Of course, Michal's work focus is on refugees and migration, giving his research and his job. His focus is on East Central Europe in the 19th and 20th century, anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, and then especially the voices and the participation of marginalized actors here. And in his new job, he's also working strongly in the field of citizen science, also combining digital humanities into his research. Yeah, I don't want to mention all the, I think it's 50-something articles and book chapters, but let me just mention a couple of them, of the books. Refugees and citizens, new nation states as places of asylum 1914 to 1941. Then for the German speakers here, die Judenfrage in Ostmitteleuropa, historische Pfade und politisch-soziale Konstellationen. And for those who speak Czech, I'll try my best. Občané země nikoho, uprchlíci a pohyblivé hranice středno-východní Evropy 1938 to 1939. Yeah, I'm still working on the numbers. But yeah, without further ado, please, Michal, the floor is yours with your talk on humanitarian border crossings, aid in no man's land. And of course, after the talk, we'll also have a discussion. Thank you very much for joining us.
So thank you, Jan, for the introduction. I'm honored. I'm also somewhat humbled by the long list of achievements and the long list of publications. And thank you to Magda and to Andrew for the introductions that I think fit the theme of my talk today very well. So what I'm going to do today is that I'll provide a case study that's based on my research over the past decade about no man's land at the end of the 1930s in East Central Europe. And I think it relates very well to some of the questions, methodological, but also more specifically regional, that were voiced before. So let me first lead us to a specific place where no man's land appeared. In June 1938, the Czechoslovak Jewish humanitarian Maria Smolka traveled to a site located beyond where she usually intervened. A group of refugees was stranded on a rusty towboat that anchored on the Danube, very close to the intersection of Czechoslovak, Austrian, and Hungarian borders. And she reported, for almost 3 months, these desperate people who are not allowed to go offshore anywhere have been held in the hope of being rescued, end quote. Even for the seasoned social worker, this no man's land was something new. It was a very challenging phenomenon. So in a nutshell, what I'd like to do today is, now reformulating my text, is I'd like to relate to the two meanings of border matters. Border matters, I'll relate to it in the sense of looking at no man's land and humanitarians at the end of the 1930s. I'll try to give you some detail about how humanitarians delivered aid, but more importantly, how they reported about and how they conceptualized no man's land. But in the second meaning, borders matter. They're not just there, they have meaning, and I'll try to whereas the first part is something that's more or less concluded in terms of research for me. The second part is something that is a question. And the question is how this research, how this particular case study can be mobilized to tell us something new about humanitarianism more broadly. Whether this is going to be successful is up to your judgment. And I'm looking forward to the discussion about that. The no man's land in the late 1930s was both a continuation and a rupture, a radicalization of the process of tightening borders and policies towards refugees in interwar Europe. Even beyond that, refugees had experienced insecure situations, both at the border or in the interior of nation states. Often they suffered from statelessness, formal one or de facto one, from limited possibilities for, say, residence permits or legal work, and their life was a precarious experience. However, the second half of the 1930s altered the spatial experience of refugeedom. And as a result, borders played an even more important role. Whereas after the Nazi accession to power in 1933, crossing borders in Europe was generally possible. Staying was difficult, staying in the countries of first refuge in particular. Now borders turned harder and became sites of ethnic profiling. And this transformation came hand in glove with the exclusion of refugees from many other spaces, such as militarized border zones, and together with the opening of refugee camps and some other camps. Often this went hand in glove with fantasies about removing Jews to some other spaces, to colonial spaces. So No Man's Land radicalized these forms of marginalization, and its emergence, I argue in my book that's published in Czech and hopefully on the way in English, I argue its emergence was the result of two parallel processes of rebordering. On the one hand, the intensified, brutal and larger in scope expulsions. Borders were changed through these brutal expulsions. On the other hand, it was the mass revocation of Jewish citizenship in Nazi Germany, as well as in nation states to its east. And borders, both the territorial ones, as well as those of citizenship, turned both tighter, but also more fluid, more unclear at the same time. Refugee migration was pushed away from established infrastructure of border crossings, pushed into spaces in which different actors, such as state officials, local population, and very importantly, humanitarians interacted in new and often unexpected ways. And now I'm giving this map instead of discussing the different locations of No Man's Land, because that would require a lot of time. My first comment, however, is that this is a very traditional form of cartography. It's the state-related cartography. These are state borders. And it's a map that very significantly doesn't represent the experience of those who were in these borders. But it gives us an idea where No Man's Land was located, and the four different expulsions that I trace in my research. This is the expulsion from Austria, especially from Burgenland, just after the Anschluss of Austria. It is Jewish refugees expelled from the borderlands of Czechoslovakia, that is Sudetenland, after the Munich Agreement, but also the deportations of Jews from Slovakia after the First Vienna Accord, and finally the events that are known here better as the so-called Polen-Aktion, the expulsion of Polish Jewish citizens from Germany at the end of October 1938. All of these were related to changes to citizenship, and all of these were related. All of these co-produced No Man's Lands that you can see on the map. Now, what I'll do here, I'll try to lead us through these No Man's Lands, so to say, in the footsteps of aid workers. At the end of 1938, an alarmed official working at the European Bureau of the JDC, the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, one of the most important Jewish aid organizations, commented on the rapid emergence of No Man's Land. Quote, "The year 1938 added a new term to European geography, No Man's Lands of the Jews," end quote. And parsing incoming reports from different sides, the JDC understood the novelty and significance of this phenomenon. But aid workers did more than just this reporting. They played a crucial role in the production of knowledge about no man's land. Without them, the information, this is the when, where, and who, this information would be severely limited. And it would also be different. Humanitarians, and also some journalists, traveling across these changing borderlines, translated between refugees who were often cut off from the world. And although sharing many of the views of the refugees, they were also very close to them culturally in most cases, they also communicated their own perceptions, their own interpretations. So these actors were essential in making up the meaning of a new type of refugee space. And their significance grew because of the often underestimated specifics of no man's lands as stateless space. And although state policy and state violence displaced Jews and forced them into the border spaces, the state, now understood as the presence of its agents, soldiers, policemen, district officials, you name it, this state was absent on the inside. The exclusionary power of the state was concentrated on the border, drawn around refugees, sometimes literally around their bodies, as they were wandering in these disorienting border spaces. And the inside of no man's land remained unregulated and largely invisible to the administrative practices of nation states. So even though borders, their delimitation, their demarcation, protection, as well as their violation, all of this figures large in state-produced archives. The events and people within no man's land remain invisible and they remain silent. And in my research, I draw inspiration on a lot of these studies that were mentioned already by Andrew, and things roughly based on social construction of space. So understanding space as produced by actors and their actions. It includes, to follow, for instance, Michael Esch and Beatrice von Hirschhausen, it includes their perception, experience, and organization. And this can be productively combined with research on borders and the concepts of bordering and the method of borderscapes, which, according to Chiara Brambilla, quote, involves a shift from a fixed knowledge to a knowledge capable of throwing light on a space of negotiating actors, experiences, and representations, end quote. Refugee spaces, such as no man's land, didn't come into existence and weren't maintained as planned and ordered, but rather through the interaction and movement of actors with their different roles, different levels of mobility, different knowledge, and different vision in the sense of ability to see and to testify. So today I'll zoom on one group, and that's the humanitarians and some selected journalists who traveled alongside them. Humanitarians and journalists not only shared the mobility and ability to cross borders, but also acted together, whereas aid workers brought material aid and tried to organize emigration. Their press colleagues made wards cross the otherwise impenetrable border. And they very quite frequently not only published articles, but also served as messengers by bringing news and appeals for help to relatives living in other countries. So creating and mediating an image of the humanitarian situation was an important aspect of aid activities, and in that I joined critical research on images and languages of humanitarianism that try to affect compassion among the audiences and sponsors. To quote Heide Fernbach and Davide Rodogno, who wrote in reference to photography, humanitarian imagery gave form to meaning to human suffering, rendering it comprehensible, urgent, and actionable. Humanitarian reporting and the related journalism played a key role in translating No Man's Land into an event that conveyed the meaning about the world of 1938. So, to repeat myself a little bit, I'm going to deal less with the real aid delivered, but rather with the image that was communicated. And I argue that the representations given by humanitarians could not be understood without a spatial experience, which was an inherent part of their action, but it's also a significant part of most of humanitarian activities generally. So again, I invite us to read reports written by humanitarians who were crossing to No Man's Land. And there's a number of shorter or longer travelogues that capture the moments of traversal of borders and arrival. So for instance, Shlomo Lipsky, traveling to the Danube barge, recorded the need to turn off from a highway when traveling from Bratislava to Budapest and to take, quote, a very bad path that winds its way between the Danube on one side and the forest on the other, end quote. Thus indicating the environmental conditions of No Man's Land and the departure from the infrastructure of mobility. The distances across which humanitarians reported differed widely from transcontinental by transnational humanitarian actors to a few kilometers for Jews from the vicinity. For instance, Ruth Kopečková remembered how her mother learned to ride a bicycle so that she can bring food and tea to No Man's Land that appeared just behind their house, so to say, across the demarcation line in South Moravia. So, but no matter the distance, the very different humanitarian actors shared a physical experience that included chaotic and changing travel routes, moving beyond roads, stations, and hotels. It also included exposure to nature and to weather in ways that both confirmed and diverged from the perception of refugees. And let me give you one more such report. And that's by Beatrice Wellington, who was a Canadian aid worker in post-Munich Czechoslovakia. So although not encountering, she was traveling to Miloslavov in southern Slovakia, and although not encountering any dramatic obstacles, Wellington devoted surprising attention to the traversal of the border. She says, "We started from Bratislava by car at about 2 o'clock. The main road through this area was in Hungarian hands, so we had to go by more cart tracks. It took us nearly an hour to go about 15 kilometers." And then she goes on and describes the mostly abandoned country, different languages spoken, big surprise to her. And although the location was known to her from a military map that she saw before, the territory was still, military map could be this kind of cartography, obviously. The territory was disorienting and the arrival unexpected. Quote, "Quite suddenly, on this great plain of ploughed fields and occasional trees, we came upon a wire entanglement and a few smoking mounds. This was, in her terminology, this was the camp." The description was almost as long as the encampment, as the description of this encampment itself. And that indicates to us that the way she traveled, her experience on the way, was meaningful to her. But perhaps we could also say that it was constitutive of the humanitarian action in No Man's Land. And Wellington's narrative also indicates that the power of the experience of the border crossing was essential for aid workers who were traveling to No Man's Land. So it's not just the practical problems, how you get there, where you turn right or left. Anthropologists Arnold van Gennep, Victor Turner, and others examine the rites of passage, a well-known concept, obviously. Rites of passage that accompany structure and give meaning to changes of status in human experience. And they argue that transitions as different as reaching adulthood, crossing an ocean, or attaining social position, all of these follow a similar three-step structure, and each of them with its own sets of rituals. That is the separation, the transitions to the liminal space or liminal time, and reincorporation. And I join the anthropologist Lisa Smirl in examining the liminal experience of humanitarians, focusing on accounts of Western aid workers traveling to third world locales. Smirl argued that, quote, the views, interactions and relationships of the field constituted a rite of passage, and the space of field a liminal space, end quote. And she analyzed the compounds and hotels and cars. These are the iconic Land Rovers used by the Red Cross or other agencies, and concluded that within the liminal spaces of aid, quote, the initiates, that's the aid workers, the initiates are cordoned off from the societies in which they are supposed to be assisting, end quote. And in my analysis, I'd like to add to her interpretation not only by zooming in on historical situations and historical sources, but also by generalizing the rites of passage to different scales and constellations of humanitarianism. So, and I argue to repeat myself a little bit, but I like the formulation, so you'll excuse me, that the various forms of border traversals and experiences of liminality were common to humanitarians in 1938, irrespective of the distance they traveled to assist, be it measured in kilometers, in class, or in language. Aid workers didn't witness the passage in the same way as refugees, because refugees experienced violent rituals that symbolically communicated their social death. They communicated the erasure of their identity and were very often connected with acts of humiliation in the form of a public violent performance. For refugees, the border became a movable labyrinth, whereas for humanitarians, even the fluid and dangerous border still kept its directionality and functional nature. They would get from one point to the other. They would get to the site where they were helping. The identities and emotions of humanitarians, however, were also affected by the transformational experience of border traversal, although differently. They experience what Van Gennep described as, quote, the magico-religious aspect of crossing frontiers, end quote. And in particular, it was stepping out of the territory, protection, and infrastructure of the nation state that was an emotional experience shared by all actors, including humanitarians. And perhaps as a side comment, but an important one for understanding their actions, is that moving into spaces beyond the nation state contributed to the growing crisis mode of Jewish humanitarianism in the late 1930s, because it was a climax of a process in which Jewish refugees were excluded from state-provided support, and they were increasingly made dependent on Jewish welfare. So bringing aid across the border to no man's land could save lives, did save lives, but it also risked a confirmation of refugees' non-citizenship. And in a broader context, it made dramatically apparent the risk of falling into the trap of prolonging and perhaps worsening the suffering of those whom aid workers selflessly aimed to help, or what sometimes is called the paradox of humanitarian action. The anthropologist Elizabeth Dunn says, quote, the long-term limbo of displacement stems not just from the ongoing nature of modern conflict, but also from the live worlds humanitarian aid creates. Now, I argue that the different regimes of mobility between humanitarians and refugees created new social hierarchies. And I'd like to use a testimony about the distribution of aid in Chojnice, Koniec, aid that was provided by local, if you want, Eastern Jews, Polish Jews, to Western Jews who were deported across this border. And the witness in a testimony written quite shortly after the events says, quote, people from Kurfürstendamm, in Berlin, obviously, very wealthy, they queued up at 2 a.m. until it was their turn to get a piece of dry bread and a glass of tea. The people had tears in their eyes. It was a state that can hardly be described in words, end quote. So the inability to take care of themselves and to provide aid to others, that means to Eastern Jews, was also a sign of the decline of the citizenship of German Jews. And perhaps it was so it is a kind of situation of rebordering between the groups. And perhaps it was no coincidence that the eyewitness called those bringing aid ladies and gentlemen, Damen und Herren, indicating their social status, while refugees, including himself, were just people, Leute. Now, traveling to No Man's Land required not only crossing territorial borders, but also, in their perception, those between the present and the past. So flying by plane from Warsaw to Poznań and continuing by car, Henryk Stoskis, a Polish Jewish publicist, an activist, Stoskis contrasted No Man's Land with the progress of society in modern times. And he says, mankind has been made happy by electricity, radio and television. Here I am flying to visit my broken exiled brothers from Berlin and Vienna. So history, and particularly Jewish pre-emancipation history, seem to offer a template for the interpretation of the dramatic events in late 1930s. Stoskis invoked anti-Jewish violence of the Middle Ages and, quote, the horrible ritual of modern Inquisition. End quote. And Šmolka referred to Masada, Lipsky compared the towboat on the Danube to Noah's Ark. So the figurative symbolical travel between modernity and the past in these accounts also gave expression to different concepts of time. And so this paper is more about space and this conference is more about space, but the changing concepts of time are important. Against the idea of progress and linear time, No Man's Land stood for stagnation, cyclical, or if you want, staggered time. Humanitarians' target-oriented and forward-directed understanding of time clashed with the stagnating, disorienting time of refugees. So it was the experience of the border space that separated the perspectives of refugees and humanitarians. And in the following, I'd like to give some space to humanitarians' reflection on liminality. Arriving in Zbonczyń, the director of the JDC in Poland, Jacek Gitterman, found a situation, as he says, beyond all possibility to describe. And I'd like to draw attention to his language that was, in my view, characteristic of much of the humanitarian reporting from and about No Man's Land. And he says, just like 2 days after the No Man's Land in Zbonczyń appeared, about 2,500 persons, many of them infirm and suffering, were standing, or at best lying on the background in the halls of the station building. And he also noticed that some people were still in their underwear or pajamas in which they were deported. But in that way, by highlighting this, he's also conveying the image of sleep or being in a state of suspension. Gittermans and other descriptions of suffering are certainly factually correct, and that can be corroborated by refugee testimonies as well as photographs such as this one from the first days in Zbončin that show crowd of exhausted people waiting with what remained of their suitcases. But Gittermans' language also implies the passive resignation to the fate on the part of refugees. And accordingly, the terms such as standing, lying, or sitting are central to such reports. Photographic representations adopted a similar visual language, and emblematic are images taken by a professional press photographer in No Man's Land in South Moravian town, or close to South Moravian town of Břeclav, Lundenburg in German. And this particular photo shows two women silently sitting in a dark tent on straw and passively looking in an indiscriminate direction. And that this photograph that was perhaps the most widely distributed photograph from No Man's Land that was published in Western, especially Anglo-Saxon, but also French press. And that happened, I think, exactly because it corresponded to the expectations connected to No Man's Land. In locales where refugees were left outside of a built area, the reports also indicated the erosion of the integrity of body and perhaps mind in confrontation with nature and weather. So consider Šmolka's report from her visit to the field close to Miloslavov, Mištorf, South Slovakia. She found refugees in an open field in a temperature which went as low as 2 degrees, etc., etc. And she says they built scanty huts and roofs from maize stalks and duck pits in which they placed their children. And just to illustrate how the power of this image at that time, especially among the Jewish public, I want to compare it to an article by the Czech journalist Milena Jesenská, who didn't visit No Man's Land herself, I think, but she learned about it, it's the same situation, she learned about it from Šmolka, either from Šmolka's report or from her directly. And Jesenská emotionalized Šmolka's narrative, but kept its key components. And she says, with his bare hands, the father digs 3 holes in the hard soil and places one child into each of them. He uses dried corn stalks to weave a roof over their heads, and he himself sits down on a clod of earth next to them. Now, in contrast to the alleged passivity and lack of agency, it is the humanitarians, of course, in these narratives, who appear to possess agency, who act, speak, report, label, name places, people, and different phenomena. This tallies well with research on and critique of humanitarianism, that the critique that humanitarians treat their clients as speechless emissaries, just to use the well-known term coined by Liza Malky, who argued that humanitarians focus on the suffering victim, that is in their perspective and action devoid of personal views and history, and they focus on the management of refugee bodies. And now, to move towards the conclusion, I want to give one last example. I think there's enough of them. One that will bring us to a different locale, one not captured by the previous map, but one that I find particularly important. And I want to give attention to border perceptions of Moses Beckelman, who was a JDC official in Lithuania at the end of 1939, and together with a group of humanitarians and a journalist who visited No Man's Land between Nazi-occupied Poland and Lithuania at the end of 1939. And that was in the so-called Suwałki Triangle here on that border. And he described the travel of the humanitarian committee, the very complicated negotiations with a stubborn Lithuanian border official, and finally he discussed the visit to a group that was stuck on a cold and windy field. Standing there without any protection. And he was also able to take a few snapshots, and because they were taken clandestinely, they're not of a very high quality, but the low quality in a way testifies about this No Man's Land better than anything else. Now, Beckelman was a social worker, and although relatively young, he was already accustomed to talk to people in need who were distracted and incoherent. But he found it particularly difficult to communicate with the outcasts in this No Man's Land. And he described this experience in highly gendered terms. He said it was impossible to talk to them coherently, since women were wailing and screaming to us. The men, for the most part, stood about pathetically, grim-looking, etc. And two kids were off to one side crying. So women screaming, men pathetic, and children crying. So the harsh environment exacerbated the perceived lack of agency and the speechlessness of refugees, reflecting, I think, an absence of language for refugee spaces on the outside of state authority. But what I want to show with Beckelman doesn't end with this, because we've seen that in the other cases as well. Next to his professionally written reports, he was also making a diary. And the most astonishing part of his diary entry about this situation was not about refugees, however, but about himself, his own lack of emotional response. And he said, "What amazed me was the fact that it moved me not at all. That the chief reaction it aroused in me was acute discomfort and mild annoyance. And I'm quite puzzled to account for this, since any number of times in the past weeks, tears have started to my eyes, as I have been told of individual instances of refugees. But these people struck me as being inhabitants of another world and aroused practically no feeling in me whatever." Now, I hope this leads us to some concluding thoughts. So we've seen that humanitarians travel and gaze on and from the border, can help to unpack borders as spatial experience and also in their more figurative meanings. It can help us unpack all that as a central aspect of humanitarian work. Attending to numerous No Man's Lands in 1938, aid workers weren't just delivering material aid or acting as empathetic observers. Beckelman's reflections betray the impact of the crossing of borders into stateless spaces, crossings that were accompanied by rights of separation and perception of liminality. And it shows that the speechlessness of no man's land affected not just refugees, but also humanitarians. The rites of passage are a humanitarian experience. Border crossing is a humanitarian experience. And it's something that not only contrasted with the immobility of refugees, their clients, but something that also formatted their emotions. Their emotions are central for understanding this. Their emotions and views of humans, of nature, and ultimately of themselves. Now, the experience of humanitarians in this particular situation was forged, took place in a situation of extreme exclusion, very violent border situation. Yet I think it points to a more generic aspect of humanitarian work and humanitarian thinking. Even though crossing borders easily, and today often imagining a borderless world, well, perhaps little less than a few years back, but still, humanitarian experience and work are affected by the way they pass between territories, sovereignties, and statuses of themselves and others. Now, borders or border work are not unknown entities in humanitarian studies. Researchers such as Michel or Polly Pallister-Wilkins and others developed their critique of humanitarian engagement in border situations, situations in which aid organizations participate in establishing and maintaining an unjust regime of unequal mobility, one that is, among other factors, also defined by race. And borders are not only geographic outlines of states, but in Agir's words, and of course in line with what we have already heard about current border studies, they are, quote, a place, a situation, or a moment that ritualizes the relationship to the other, unquote. And so in this paper, I drew on Lisa Smirl's reading of humanitarian accounts as rites of passage. But all these interpretations about current humanitarianism, current humanitarian border work, are related to problems of Western-driven international activity of large humanitarian organizations. I don't know how much humanitarian studies are known here, but I want you, I think, add one last reference, and that's to Didier Fassin, who in his Humanitarian Reason formulated the paradox of humanitarianism, the paradox that, quote, the politics of compassion is a politics of inequality. So following up, end quote, following up on this argument, I contend that the study of humanitarian paradoxes, or of how this inequality is produced in the day-to-day practice of aid, all this would greatly profit from drawing on the border experience of those providing aid, and vice versa, we can grasp humanitarianism as a form of bordering. And the paradox here, of course, is that humanitarianism is conceptualized around the notion of solidarity. Humanitarianism builds solidarity between people, places, situations, sometimes to very distant people. But at the same time, the same activity that draws this solidarity also creates new borders. So, to really conclude, and of course I'm posing all this here for questions, for discussion, and I'm looking forward to your comments and ideas. So to conclude, reading the reports of aid workers traveling to No Man's Land, I suggest that border crossings in the broader sense of the word, be it borders of states or social and cultural divides, that these borders need to be researched as an essential aspect of humanitarianism, or perhaps even of its definition, part of its definition, an aspect around which its many activities, dilemmas, hierarchies, and paradoxes coalesce. It is the border experience that makes aid recipients strangers, and the hierarchies and divisions of power, solidarity, or paternalism real and lived. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Michal, for a great presentation, also very moving. If you think about what's going on in the world today, the images you showed reminded me really of the refugee camp in Idomeni, or also the situation at the Polish-Belarusian border. So that's something that is still with us, unfortunately. And so this was really, gave us deep insight. So we now have about 40 minutes for the discussion. And I kindly ask you to raise your hand if you have a question, and please also introduce yourself briefly. Yeah, so we can start right away. If not, I also have a couple of questions. But
thank you so much for this enlightening introduction to a conference, to a workshop. My name is Ettore Recchi from Sciences Po Paris. I'm not a historian. I'm not particularly versed into this particular moment of history, but I'm intrigued by this notion of no man's land, and I was wondering a bit naively whether there was a legal definition of what was a no man's land, or whether it was a vernacular definition of the locals, of the people involved, and whether this definition was somehow contested in some instances by the actors involved. Thank you.
Are we collecting, or thank you? Are we collecting, or should I?
do we have immediately more questions, so we can collect maybe 3?
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. My name is Sanva Dahlke from the Max Weber Network Eastern Europe. I have perhaps a more practical question. If you say that, and that's obvious, that compassion creates hierarchies, but what would you offer instead? I think historians are very able to describe these power hierarchies, but in a more practical sense, what would you offer? What would you do instead of compassion?
Hi, I'm Didi. I'm a visiting scholar in Washington at the GHI. I just have a very small clarification question on, because the quote on his emotional reaction is so striking. I'm just curious where he's from geographically, and if those people came, like you said in the beginning, are themselves Polish Jews, or are they traveling from the US or from Britain? And if this geographic sort of proximity has any meaning in that. Are they seeing themselves as future victims of Nazism or not? And yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you for the wonderful question. I start from the last one because we all have just looked at it right now. And so Moses Beckelman was a US citizen, and I think he was born in the US, and he was educated as a social worker and worked in social services in New York, of social services of some kind. And then he joined the JDC, the Jewish Aid Organization, and was sent all the way to Lithuania in this very critical situation. It's not just the no man's land. Lithuania is full of refugees at this time. Some of them legal, many of them illegal. And everything's missing, and Lithuanian borders are moving. And so you know, this is a very, very difficult situation. So he comes from distance. He probably doesn't fear about himself so much, although, of course, this is a dangerous situation. But he is also, in another sense, very close to his clients because he speaks Yiddish. And I think probably his parents, I don't know much about him personally, but I think his parents immigrated from somewhere from Eastern Europe. So that it's this kind of strange combination of humanitarian distance and professionalism and the closeness, cultural closeness, and the possibility to empathize with those whom he was aiding. With regard to the first question, whether there was a legal definition of no man's land or a vernacular one, I like the word vernacular, by the way, or if it was contested in some form. The first answer is very simple, no. Because there's no possibility for a legal definition for something which exists outside of law. But not just in an Agambenian sense, I'd be a bit critical here, but more in the sense this is really beyond the control of the state. And state actors, when they have to discuss this, very clearly struggle with terminology. Because just whatever is outside doesn't make sense. Or perhaps even more, it endangers the nation state. The territorial nation state in Europe should not allow any space in between. That just should not exist, perhaps in colonial spaces, but not right here in Europe. Now, on the other hand, the term was immediately used by refugees themselves, as well as by humanitarians. It was used in Jewish press, and more broadly in the public. For more reasons, I think one of them is obvious. It's a reference to the First World War. And so everyone in that generation knew reports of no man's land in the First World War. So it's kind of reconceptualized, adopted to describe the in-betweenness of the experience of Jewish refugees. Whether this was contested is a difficult question. It would also depend what contestation means. I think I'm not so much aware of contestation of the term itself, saying this is not no man's land, but more whether we can describe it as a form of non-compliance or, if you want, resistance. And there's not much research on no man's land, but there's in one conceptual article written by two geographers, Leshem and Pinkerton, they end up with discussing the kind of resistance that's created in these liminal spaces. Perhaps a little bit in the sense of Victor Turner's liminoid spaces that liberate you from whatever modern liberal order or whatever you want to understand behind that. But this is not what I see there. I don't see a revolution. Of course, some people thought we will be liberated from that if we survive this, by moving to Palestine, because they were Zionists. But mostly, there is no clear way out of no man's land. The kind of resistance that I could see, that I could offer, is what's invisible in these reports, that people organize, they create a committee on the field in Mischdorf, this kind of field muddy photograph. They collect the few potatoes that are left somewhere on the field and distribute them evenly among themselves. So it's this kind of resistance. Plus another one, and that's the kind of actions that were understood as illegal from the perspective of nation states. So escaping most typically, or smuggling food, etc. What we can offer beyond this critique? That's a very difficult question, and I was asking myself, reading some of the research about it. I think in particular when I was reading Polly Pallister-Wilkins' book that looks at humanitarians at borders, such as the Greek islands in current or recent situations, and I felt that the critique is true. And it's very important, but it's also going nowhere. And I think we need to, when working with this, we need to realize, or my option is, not to try to create an ideal world where there's no hierarchy, but to understand that these hierarchies, these inequalities are inescapable. That instead of devoting our energy to taking them away, we perhaps should try to think critically about how to make them smaller. I'm not sure if this is an answer, but it's my attempt at it.
Thank you, Michal. I have just as Jan, I had to think. I had all the time. I had in mind also the situation on the Polish-Belarusian border, which took place 2, 3, 4 years ago, and seems very similar to what you are talking about. And in the case of the Polish-Belarusian border, one of the problems was that humanitarian aid was made as difficult as possible. So the Polish state organized something which they called a protection zone, which had about 3 kilometers breite. Width, thank you. And it was almost impossible to enter, neither for journalists nor for people offering humanitarian aid. How was it regulated in 1938? Because it seems scary to me to think that it might have been easier to get aid in 1938 than in 2020. And then just a small question regarding the map which you showed us at the very beginning. You mentioned that it's a traditional state cartographic map, and you seemed to be not very happy with that. What would be the alternative?
My name is Annika Wienert. I'm a researcher here in Warsaw at the German Historical Institute, and I will my question kind of builds up on both what Magda just said and what Sandra Dahlke asked. But I want to turn our attention to another EU border in the Mediterranean, namely, which is one of the deadliest borders in the world to cross, and has been so for many, many years now. The sea rescue for people in danger at this high sea is an obligation of every nation state, but the EU decided to just get rid of that obligation, and so here humanitarian aid comes in as a substitute for something that should be that by law, I mean by the words of the law, is still should still be covered by the state. And I'm coming to my question in a second. Frontex, a EU organization, is based here in Warsaw, surprise. And I think it's perhaps no coincidence that it is here and not in another EU country, but it is not a democratic institution. And so here I think adding to compassion with the people drowning in the Mediterranean, we should add something like a just general political engagement with the governing bodies that we live under, because even though this does not affect us here immediately, these are still an institution that is part of the EU and by that also by the governments that we elected and so on and so forth. So I would build up on what you said, that not to do away with compassion or hierarchies, but critically reflect it, but also add to, I mean, just compassion alone isn't really perhaps enough for political change. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. I'm Melike Şahinol from the Orient Institute Istanbul, and I was also struck by the concept of no man's land. I mean, what is this no man's land? So, and then I thought, as I have seen the photographs which you showed, that it is somehow more a socio-technical condition than a spatial metaphor, maybe. And if we see this as socio-technical conditions, then maybe we can also analyze the happenings there as socio-technical infrastructures of care, maybe. So, and then if we do this, what would we gain? I asked myself, because it seemed to me that also the humanitarian work is a socio-technical kind of mediation work, right, within borders. So, yeah, these are more, questions when I've heard your talk, and then also when I've heard the questions before.
Thank you. Great and difficult questions. I'll start with Magda. You said scary, and that's what it is. And as a matter of fact, it was easier to get to these locations in 1938, 1939 than it's today. So in my sources, I have not really seen situations where aid could not reach these people for a long time. Sometimes they had to negotiate, sometimes they couldn't come on the first try, but within hours or days at most, they could come. They were also perhaps the nexus between humanitarians and state. I mean, a lot of it is similar, and I think I've also published on that. But perhaps the nexus might be slightly different in the sense that in 1938 the state needed humanitarians. They didn't have much care about what's on the outside, but these people in the border zone, somewhere in a demarcation line, which is a militarized space, were a problem. So you do need aid workers who prevent the worst. And No Man's Land was a deadly place, but its purpose was not to kill. It was an unintended, although quite logical result of this situation. So I think perhaps there is a changing relationship between humanitarians and the state in some form, and one part of that I think today is that the recognition that these people are on a territory that you control has more consequences. And I think that's one of the reasons for this very strict spatial control on the eastern border of Poland, because as you do not, you want to prevent, if you are anti-refugee, you want to prevent them from coming on the territory, because then they can claim asylum. And that legal framework didn't exist in 1938. So perhaps that might also might have played into that a little bit. I don't know if media, such as, these are slow media. Today we have the very quick, immediate, ever-present social media and other media, if that also changed the balance in some way, because it's an immediate, alarming visibility that you get today. In terms of the map, and Magda, I think you were the only one in this room who heard my talk a year ago or 2 years ago, is, of course, we need more these traditional maps like that one that work with state borders and simplify the experience, and perhaps it's a good starting point. But there's more reasons why this is not accurate. One of them is that we want to go beyond the perceptions of state actors that are so much invested into the territoriality of the modern nation state, and that imagine the border as the line in the sand. That's what this map does, and we have that at school. So it's a very influential tool. Obviously, it's not an innocent map. The other reason is that people who were thrown into that refugees especially had a completely different understanding of space. They were also lost in the space. I've referred to this notion of a labyrinth or a movable labyrinth. Very often the kind of space that makes sense is taken apart, doesn't function for them any longer. They go in circles. And the interesting thing is that in some situations, like for instance, Burgenland Jews who are in this, okay, this is not the right map, but who are in this kind of corner, they are from this area. They're moving all the time within 20 kilometers from their homes, or mostly 20, sometimes 3 kilometers, but they don't understand that space. The spatial experience is just a different one, as is the temporal experience. So I would be interested to experiment with maps, and I'm not a cartographer, but there's a lot of elements in terms of deep maps, human maps, maps that also incorporate this kind of experience. Mediterranean. I think this was more a comment than a question in terms of what we can do, and the kind of and that compassion is not enough. I think what we need, not very realistically. what we need to do is that saving lives. Try to persuade the policymakers that saving life, it doesn't mean offering asylum, and that these are still two different, on some level, different things. You may not accept a person to a refugee status in a country, whatever we think about this, but you don't let this person drown in the Mediterranean. So I think there's. It is all about not necessarily about the outcome of this process in the very specific legal framework in which we operate, the convention, refugee convention, and all the national laws and all the European laws, but it's about entry to this legal process. I, however, struggle with thinking about how to persuade policymakers in the very difficult situation today to do just this. So this is a very skeptical answer, as you've noticed, as I can see. It doesn't give us a lot of hope. And no man's land as a social technical condition, that's basically infrastructures of care. So if we think about, this doesn't work from the perspective of the state, because for the government, this doesn't exist. There's nothing social technical. There's no society to help in that sense, and not to speak about infrastructures that, even if they're there, they do not work. We could, of course, try to apply this to humanitarians, because they're kind of building this. The problem is that perhaps it can blur the difference between aiding in such an unstable, fluid situation and something which is still more longer term. So building a refugee camp in Kenya by the UNHCR is much more stable than bringing help to no man's land, because no one has control, the situation's changing all the time. So I think I can draw some inspiration from that, but I'd also like to keep some difference. Plus, a lot of these humanitarians didn't perceive refugees as a kind of society. And so the social technical comes with a question mark.
First of all, thank you for a very interesting talk that has given me lots of things to think about. My question is actually more of a comment, and that has to do with the fact that I was struck when you were talking about whether these are liminal spaces or not. And it seems to me that they're not liminal, because it's not about transition. It's in a certain sense, it's about exclusion. They're kind of negative spaces or anti-spaces or some kind of non-space that is bounded for the very purpose of depriving people of things, excluding them from things. And I was struck by the level of that deprivation. I was thinking, what are the kinds of resources that might exist in no man's land? And apparently they are maize stalks and dirt. And not much else. The people are there to be deprived of citizenship. They're ultimately deprived of humanity, if you look at the quote from Beckelmann. I wonder if maybe sort of one of the strangest aspects of this is this deprivation of the passage of time, because this seems like something that is observable also on the borders of the Schengen zone to some extent, where people are constantly forced to, I think Caroline Leutloff-Granditz has written about this, where, everything is completely stuck and doesn't move, and then all of a sudden you very urgently have to get together all your paperwork for the bureaucrats to process it, or your appointment is gone. But I wonder if you want to say anything about sort of this use of time being weaponized as a tool of exclusion.
Hello, Sophia Wojcicka. I'm working here in Warsaw, and thanks a lot. I have a lot of questions, but I try to be concise. So one is actually very basic, but I'm very interested in general in this context of refugees in the beginning of, not in the beginning, in the beginning of Second World War on this Lithuanian Polish border and the Suwałki incident. And I tried to figure out even before, but couldn't really understand what was the end of this conflict? Like, what I understand that most of them would somehow stay in Lithuania, but how was it sort of solved, or how does it dissolve this issue, and how to imagine this? Because in Zbąszynek you had the camp finally, yes, where those people were put into. But how was it if you say no man's land? Is it just a place sort of beyond the former Polish border, now the German border, which was in Lithuania, but the people are not allowed to go farther into Lithuania? Or how to imagine this no man's land in terms of space? And the second comment was just that it's tempting to make comparisons, and it makes sense between now and then, but I think there are also so many differences. For example, what Magda mentioned, and you said, now you have the law that refugees can claim asylum, which we didn't have now. So the situation is also different because those people were expelled, and the own country didn't either. They were expelled from their own country, or the country which was actually they were citizens of, in case of Poland, didn't want to accept them. So the sort of starting situation is different than with the refugees now, in a way. So,
thank you. My name is Franz Waldenberger. I'm director of the German Institute of Japanese Studies in Tokyo. Far away, and I also know very little about that, but I try to figure out a little more. So it relates to the previous question. I mean, in what sense was this sort of an end situation, or were the people safe? Were they really finally escaped? Could they finally escape? Or was it just temporary? That's one thing. The other thing is, how did these aid workers and these people actually get together? I mean, what kind of mechanism was there to bring these people in the no man's land together with humanitarian aid? There must have been a kind of network or information, public information. And in that sense, wasn't that also a risk? I mean, having information about where these people are, if they were trying to escape from somewhere, if there was public information about where they are. These are all things that trying to figure out, maybe you can help. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for these wonderful questions, really. And I'll perhaps start from Andrew, a little bit challenging me on liminality, which I think could be a very interesting conversation, and perhaps we can continue in that as we go forward. But I think why I call this liminality is because of the experience of traversal. That's all about rights of separation, to my mind, and it is so very often accompanied by very violent acts. It is actually, in many cases, the border where this violence comes. The other question is, where is the border? But in case of Polish Jews from Germany who were deported to the Polish border, they travel in, of course it's a deportation, it's horrible, but they travel on trains in a relatively still civilized way, crowded, but not much violence, and then they get off in the border space, and that's the dogs, shouts, shooting, and real physical violence unleashes on them. So it is a kind of ritual of separation. Of course, we can say this doesn't happen on the border itself only, such as if you think about the well-known Viennese scenes with Jews forced and humiliated by cleaning the streets. That's also very happening in parallel to what's taking place in Burgenland, more or less around the same time. But for me, these are rights of separation, and I think the other thing, the representations of the space, but also self-representations sometimes, I think indicate this kind of that liminality is at work. So side comment: liminality is a very vague concept as well, by the way. But it's because the reason why it's there is because of the reversals, lack of identity, lack of name, and then of course everything that happens to space and time. So that I think is a good indication. Now, perhaps I'll come back to time later. I'll try not to forget, because I think one of the things that I was looking at is, so I come through the rights of separation to liminality, and then what? What's the way out? Because the kind of rights of reintegration, the third stage of the rites of passage, is mostly missing in the perception of people who came through No Man's Land. And it's very often quite hard to tell what's the end of No Man's Land. When did it end? Some people escaped, perhaps. Some people were allowed to go into the interior after a few weeks. Some people were able to emigrate with the help of Jewish aid organizations. But there's never actually a decision. So let's close this. Because the states that created this situation do not see the No Man's Land. And very often, and it's even, there's one thing that I've not discussed here really, is that in some cases No Man's Land moves to the interior of the country from the border. With the permission of the state. The best known case obviously is Bonn. I'm mixing your questions together right now, which is a town. It's not really a camp, it's Jewish refugees are in the town. There's approximately the same number of them as the number of inhabitants of Bonn. But there's been a lot of other cases, and these are the bluish square points, locations on that map, where refugees were allowed out of No Man's Land because this was an impasse. But they were placed in locations where, as if they were not on the territory. And we know it more broadly from that states also nowadays manipulate own territories so that they don't have to allow people to claim their rights, whatever they are. And so these were typically Jewish homes or improvised camps under the care of Jewish aid organizations that had to promise that the state will not be involved, that there will be no costs, and all of these things. And the interesting part is, after some time, the governments have no memory of why they have actually done that. It's one of the striking things, and it's the same as Bonn. Have you ever found the order to close Bonn? No, it's closed because of the beginning of the Second World War, when Germans invade. And it kind of emptied before that, mostly. And all these different homes, at one moment, no one knows why they're there. So it's this kind of interesting thing that, so while there's the end of the situation, because this is not set, these people are still uncertain in between. And it's this kind of situated statelessness that is not declared, but that you find out at one moment when you encounter a state official, come to a consulate or something else. Okay, I'm trying to come back. Perhaps I'll stay with Zbončin and No Man's Land.
And Suwałki.
And Suwałki, yep. But I think I'm trying to avoid naming it a camp, because for me, camp is, at least in my definition, and I think it's helpful for understanding No Man's Land, camp is organized by someone, by state actors or humanitarians. They order space, they order time, and you can think perhaps the best thing to compare it with is the First World War camps in the Habsburg monarchy. I mean, in this broader territory. Or camps that appear after the Munich Agreement in Czechoslovakia. Those are all organized, and with that comes some responsibility. And No Man's Land is not that, and that applies to Zbončin as well. These people were thrown in there. The state has kind of rebordered, so while this is Polish territory, they've drawn the border around them, and more or less around exit points. So they would control the railway station and the ways out of Zbončin, but that's all. It's slightly different in terms of local government, because they have to deal with this. That could complicate. But to my mind, there's a good reason to call that No Man's Land, even if it's in the interior. And I also call some of these places shelters, just to have which is an imperfect label, but just to have a word to use. Okay, Suwałki. Suwałki. I've just an article published about it, so you're invited to read it, where I discuss this in more detail. It's very hard to document. There's more locations along that border. These people are really in between. They're really expelled by the Nazis. From the Suwałki Triangle is more violent than many other places because of the shifting sovereignty and close border. And then after a few weeks, the problem's gone. Right? Lithuanian is gone in the sense that these people are not on the field any longer. And at the beginning, Lithuanian diplomats complained very bitterly in Berlin that, what are you doing to us? You're sending these people across our border. They were obviously in a very weak position in these negotiations. But after some weeks, the No Man's Land in this sense is not there. In most cases, I think some people died there, but in most cases they were smuggled out of there. And the Jewish communities in Lithuania organize quite an efficient system of smugglers and activists from Jewish communities who kind of bring them step by step to places in the interior. I am not able to say really well how that affected their longer term situation, because I can't track them. I suspect that unlike a lot of other refugees in Lithuania who were legally there, think of all the Polish refugees, these people were illegal. But what that meant, in what situation, I think is beyond what I can do in my research. And you also compare there's this comparison between nowadays and 1938 because of the difference. what did I want to say? I think there's a lot of differences that you can, of course, name, and that including the distance where people are coming from, and the legal framework, and all of these things. But I think it's really worthwhile looking at the similarities, that even with these bigger differences, someone's coming from Afghanistan and not which is, I don't know, thousands miles away, and not from Burgenland, which is 3 kilometers away, but they still have a very similar experience. And so I think that's still worthwhile and this kind of withdrawal of responsibility of states is something that I think is very similar. And I wanted to say it before in response to Magda, but I forgot, is watching Agnieszka Holland's movie, Zielona granica in Polish, right? It's just granica? Green border. Yeah. And which is interestingly not very well known in the West. It was very strongly received in Czechia and around in our region, but not beyond. That was one of the most difficult experiences for me as historian, because I've just seen these parallels, and that was the moment where I felt powerless. And if I have to be honest, I wanted this film to continue, but also to end immediately, because it was a hard experience. And I think the last thing from my list now is time. Right? And that's so I'm devoting some attention to this in the book, where I try to show that this linear time, also time of modernity, and the time structures of the state dissolve already on the way to no man's land, because when you're coming in circle, perhaps you try to count days. But even if you count days, you find out yourself in a kind of cyclical time structure. And in particular, I used Zbončin to illustrate that refugees also refer to these structures. They write letters in which they say, for the past many weeks, day by day, I've been queuing at the aid committee and all of this. So I think this time difference is this kind of different concept of time is a very important part of this.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm Debarati I'm from Delhi, India, Max Weber Forum in Delhi. So I was really struck by many of the points that you made, how that resonates with the South Asian literature on statelessness. Particularly, just to give one example that comes offhand, like William Schendel's work on statelessness in South Asia and what these no man's lands between India and Bangladesh look like. And particularly as we know that decolonization in South Asia came along fragmentation of that territory. So Bangladesh, India and Pakistan, they share a kind of colonial past. And there are these, Schendel shows dots on these maps, very many no man's lands, enclaves that are surrounded by the other nation, the other territory of the nation. So in Bangladeshi no man's lands surrounded by Indian territory and all of that. And as you say, the people there are the most vulnerable to trafficking and all sorts of things. I'm really I just more of a comment more than question. I was also thinking in terms of how the state not only is this a question about the state not taking responsibility or kind of how the state is looking at these statelessness kind of a situation, but also how the state often functions in a way that this statelessness kind of it becomes a recurrent and consistent thing. The state also sometimes doesn't want to end it because it becomes part of such a bigger political stance in that territoriality. So I'm just now thinking of how, say for the present regime in India, they are creating new territories of statelessness because of their own survival. Because now they have to spot and identify who were the illegal, so-called quote-unquote illegal migrants, and they are setting new cut-off dates and saying that whoever came to this part of India before that date has to be called illegal, after that date will be illegal, all sorts of things. And now these detention camps are becoming new centers of statelessness, new spaces of no man's land, you can say. So I'm just wondering that on one hand there is this humanitarian aid which has a different political network of its kind, and there is also this statist network which kind of keeps the situation of no man's land going for its own sake. There is a kind of maneuvering of this situation which goes in favor of certain statist policies. I was just like...
Yeah, that will be for a long discussion. It's actually a great comment/question. I think we should organize a workshop comparing no man's lands and spatial statelessness across the globe and across periods. And so I would be very interested to do that, obviously. I'll perhaps just, I'm not going to go, because this was more a comment, and I really appreciate this. And I tried to read and think through the different cases that come from post-colonial spaces, such as Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and these studies that you named. And there's obviously we could discuss similarities and perhaps some differences, especially in how long these spaces exist and these situations exist. But I think perhaps I'll just make one comment, because I try to make case for something that I call spatial statelessness, and that is seems to be neglected to me, at least in terms of research on statelessness in Europe, in this case, interwar period and the Second World War. That's very much driven by what we've learned from Hannah Arendt, and I'm very busy learning from Hannah Arendt and was very influenced. But space doesn't play much of a role there, and I think that looking at these spaces and these localized negotiations of status would be helpful to enrich what we know about statelessness. Also, in the sense that sometimes I think we tend to imagine statelessness as status, so citizenship and statelessness, but it's not like that. Statelessness is a continuous process of finding out who you are vis-a-vis others, vis-a-vis governments, and you only see it when something happens. So I think bringing these post-colonial situations into how we think about Europe, I think would be really enriching.
Okay, thank you, Michal, for a great talk and a great discussion. Before we everybody joins us for a round of applause. Thank you again, Michal.
Thank you. Thank you all.